Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richmond, the vice president of the foundation. This is the Libertarian Angle, where you're going to get the libertarian perspective, as you see today, on the burning issues of the day compared to all those statist newspapers and internet places and stuff where, they're just going to present the standard statist philosophy. And we see this best of all right now in the so-called shutdown debate. Now, I call it the so-called shutdown debate because we all know that nothing shuts down, at least not in terms of the bigger picture. The welfare warfare state continues, and what is shut down are all of the, or at least some of the non-essential functions of government. Now, this is really funny because, if they're not essential, what do we need them for? Now, obviously what a libertarian considers non-essential and what a statist considers non-essential are two completely different things. But if we all agree that they've got this whole list of non-essential functions and all these non-essential personnel that are about to get temporarily laid off, then why not lay them off permanently? I mean, imagine the tremendous economic boom that would bring. But, of course, the statists say, oh, there's going to be economic catastrophe. I mean, this is like the end of their world for a statist. You can see it in all the op-eds. You go to any mainstream newspaper, and you'll see both conservatives and liberals, just, oh, my gosh, the world is going to come to an end. The government's going to be shut down, and they're pacing the floors, and there's anxiety. And it's really pretty funny. What do you think, Sheldon? I'm here laughing at this whole thing.
Yeah. Well, if there are non-essential services and personnel, I'm inferring from that there's then two categories of government. I don't want to call them services, but let's put quotes around that because I can't think of another word. There's two categories then. There's non-essential and then there's anti-essential. So the non-essential are, just things we can do without, and the anti-essential are actually just, keeping from emerging in free market essential services. So there's nothing essential. There's just non-essential and anti-essential. I mean, look, they're going to keep the military going. They've already, the House Republicans have voted a separate bill to not change anything regarding the military. I mean, I'd shut down the military before I shut down the Washington Monument and the Grand Canyon. Come on, let's get realistic about this. So it's pretty funny. I think the last time they had the shutdown in '95, they actually had to do counseling for the people that were told, you're non-essential, so you don't come in. It was traumatic. And I actually think they provided counseling for those people. It's not a joke. I know it sounds like something from The Onion, but I think it actually happened. You can look that up.
No, I remember that. They had self-esteem problems because, they all consider themselves as essential, all these bureaucrats that, oh my gosh, the government the nation couldn't operate without what I'm doing. And then all of a sudden they all get labeled as non-essential and they went and they had this self-esteem crisis and they had to get counseling. You're absolutely right. But I mean, notice that the whole charade of this whole thing. I mean, let's get this clear. We're talking about two separate things here, and I think it's important to delineate between the two. We're talking about on the one side the Obamacare debate, and then on the other side the debt ceiling debate, which happened to come at the same time. And what we're facing tonight with the so-called shutdown is the Obamacare debate, where the faction of the Republicans first said, well, we want to shut down Obamacare totally, and that was part of the funding bill. And, of course, the House enacts that, and the Senate rejects it and send it back without that provision. And now the Republicans have said, well, now we would just want to delay it by a year. And so now the Senate has to decide whether to have a 1-year delay, and President Obama has objected to that. And so, let's talk about that first, and then later we can talk about the debt ceiling debate if we have time. I think it's just a big charade here, Sheldon. I mean, the Republicans are as committed to the welfare warfare state as Democrats are. And so when they're talking about this shutdown, darn well it's not going to last very long. The last time this happened, I think it went 17 days, and then it scared both the Republicans and the Democrats because people realized that this wasn't having any effect on their lives, that it really didn't matter. People weren't paying attention. And I think that scared the dickens out of both Republicans and Democrats because they started to realize if people if they realize their ordinary lives are continuing, their regular daily lives are continuing with the government being shut down or all these non-essential functions being shut down, well, that doesn't bode well for the welfare warfare status, which consists of both Democrats and Republicans. So I don't think this thing's going to go on very long, because I think they all have a vested interest in keeping it going permanently. And so I think this thing's going to last just a few days. I could be wrong.
I guess it's not going to last real long. On a couple of things. On it not having an effect, I think we need to remember that since the government is involved in so many things, it actually could have an effect on people short term. For example, one thing that's come to mind, they've said that passport applications or renewals would not be processed during the time of the shutdown. Now, if you were waiting for your passport because you have a trip planned out of the country, that's going to harm you. Now, but of course, that only refers to an earlier intervention, that you needed a passport to travel in the first place. But in fact, that is the case. You're not going to be able to travel. The airports aren't going to say, well, the government shut down. I guess you don't need a passport. You're welcome to travel. I'm sure they're not going to do that. And so that could actually cause somebody inconvenience, but only because the government's involved in that in the first place. So there are ways that even innocent people will get harmed who aren't simply on the dole or, like a military-industrial complex, although they're going to exempt the military. The problem about Obamacare, of course, is that, there is a faction of the Republicans in the House that wanted to totally cut the funding. And I'm not sure, there's a lot of, I think, independent funding for Obamacare. I'm not sure how much total Congress could cut in this or remove in this continuing resolution, which they had to vote on, don't forget, only because there hasn't been a budget. They're not even doing sort of what they're supposed to be doing on paper, if you take any of that seriously. They haven't even been writing a budget. They haven't written a budget in a long time, which would be like a 2-year spending plan. So they don't do that. So the end of the fiscal year is at midnight tonight, so that's why they face a shutdown. If they get past midnight and they don't have this continuing resolution, which would take them into November sometime, there'll be the shutdown. So the question about Obamacare, you're right. The Senate was not, which is controlled by Democrats, was not going to vote for a plan that didn't fund the Affordable Care Act, so they stripped that out and then passed the rest of it and then sent it back to the House. And now the House has not passed the Senate version, but came up with a new plan, which is simply to delay the funding or delay all of the Affordable Care Act for 1 year. And now they're sending that back to the Senate. The Senate didn't come in yesterday, so they all went home. So they're coming back today. I don't think coming to session until 2 p.m. Well, that's putting them 10 hours away from shutdown time. The question is, what are they going to do? And so that's why I think there actually may be a shutdown, but we'll see how long it goes.
Well, on your first point, yeah, I agree with you that there's going to be certain functions where people are trying to take advantage of those federal, quote, services. I mean, if people are trying to go to a national park and they've got planned and then they shut down the national park, obviously it has an impact on that, or like your point about the passports. But notice what they always do in these kind of things, that the feds figure out the most important things to people to cut first. And make their lives as miserable as they can in order to essentially blackmail them into screaming that the government be put back into service. And so they're also predicting that there's going to be this economic catastrophe. And the idea is that because there are so many people employed by the federal government now, that if they don't get their salaries, they're not going to the mall to buy things, and that'll affect the people at the mall, and there'll be this ripple out effect. But I think as libertarians, we have to constantly remind people of the much bigger paradigm we're dealing here with. And that is that when you have so many people employed by the federal government doing so many things, that this is actually a drag on the economy. They create the appearance that, the economy depends on all these federal employees spending their money and so forth. But actually, you've got two separate sectors. You've got the parasitic sector, you've got the productive sector, which is the private sector. And all of that money that's being used to fund these salaries and these functions is coming out of the private productive sector. So that in the larger scheme of things, if we could lay off all these non-essential people permanently, which is what we should do, plus, a lot of others that they consider essential. As you mentioned, the huge military industrial complex, CIA, the whole welfare bureaucracy, then that leaves all that money in the private sector, which is where the productive capital comes in, and it's productivity that is the key to rising standards of living. I think that's one of the fundamental differences between libertarians and the statists. They believe in this welfare warfare state way of life, most of which is non-essential from a libertarian standpoint, and that what really is key to permanently raising economic standards, prosperity, and so forth is the private sector. And that's why we talk in terms of abolishing the income tax and the IRS and the entire welfare warfare state apparatus that has come into existence since the 1930s and through the 40s and 50s and so forth.
Yeah, when you contemplate this closure that could happen, keep in mind, as we've already said, it doesn't touch the worst aspects of the government, the prison system and the military and the CIA and the NSA. Are they all going to shut down? Do you mean for possibly 24 hours, who knows, 48 hours, the NSA won't be listening to us if there's a shutdown? I don't think that's going to happen. I think all that continues. So it's not much of a shutdown. On the other hand, any shutdown will not in any way be a libertarian experiment, which I think some of our adversaries might be tempted to say. For this reason, everybody knows the government's going to start up again. It may be a question of how long the shutdown is, but nobody actually thinks it's going to be permanent. So no entrepreneur is going to step in to provide any legitimate services that the government has been attempting to provide, because they know they'll get wiped out the moment the government starts up again. So it's not going to be any kind of like I said, experiment in libertarianism, even if it goes for 17 days.
No, and the drug war. I mean, does anybody really think that they're going to stop waging the war on drugs? Because, what could be more non-essential than that? And yet we all know that they'll continue drawing their pay, and they'll continue busting people and ruining people's lives. And I would assume that all these people that are, quote, laid off, the non-essentials, they're going to get back pay. I may be wrong on that, but my hunch is that as soon as the thing's over, they're going to just restore their pay. Now on the Obamacare thing, and my beef with Republicans, Sheldon, is that they don't get to the root of the matter. Obamacare was enacted because there was a huge healthcare crisis. And so even if you get rid of Obamacare, which of course is going to make things worse, they always do. This is what interventionism does. It produces crises, they pass new reforms that produce new crises, and it goes on and on. But if they repeal Obamacare, you're still left with the huge healthcare crisis that healthcare socialism has produced. And by healthcare socialism, I'm talking about the root of the problem: Medicare, Medicaid, insurance and healthcare regulations, and occupational licensure, medical licensure on the supply side that limits the number of healthcare providers. And once you realize that this is the root of the problem, then the only solution is to pull the weed out by its root, dismantle, repeal Medicare and Medicaid, get rid of it. It was a horrible mistake. Restore a total free market in healthcare. And this is what Republicans don't get. And the reason they don't get it is because they believe in all this socialism. So their only beef is with this particular reform. But if they got rid of this reform, darn well they'd be proposing their own kind of reform with the pretense that this is somehow going to solve all the problems that come with healthcare socialism. So nothing really changes. It's all just smoke and mirrors. It's reform nonsense. Doesn't get to the heart of the problem, which is what we libertarians do. Ditch, healthcare socialism entirely.
Yeah, in addition to all the things you named, all of which should be abolished, down to the licensing of everybody involved, is third-party payment. And a third party, whether it's the federal government or insurance companies, pay, almost all, close to, I think, 75 or 80% of what's spent on medical care. And that ends up subverting the market and market pricing and competition. And the fact that the insurance companies are involved in this is itself the result of political intervention because of employee insurance, which is not taxed as income. If we didn't have an income tax, this wouldn't be an issue. But in World War II, when there were wage controls and you couldn't give raises, companies were allowed to offer non-cash benefits as a form of compensation to attract workers. And so this is where we get started with medical insurance. But as a result of that, companies, at least in previous days, were under competition. Were trying to give the most attractive medical benefits possible, the most attractive medical policies that would cover almost, from $1. So third parties paid most people's medical expenses, even for insignificant things, non-catastrophic events, because that's how companies could compete. Don't forget, it wasn't taxed. If they simply gave you the money to go out and buy insurance, that was not worth as much. That's not worth as much under the tax laws as giving you the insurance, because the cash gets taxed, but the insurance does not. So the whole thing has been skewed. The Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, only pushes things further in that direction, and you don't get real competition and real market pricing if everybody feels they're not paying for the services. And that's one of the, in addition to all the things you named, that is one of the very serious flaws, and that has to be corrected by getting the government out of the whole matter.
Yeah, it's just another instance of where government intervention inevitably produces these warped distortions that then require new interventions. And of course, one of the questions that we're often asked as libertarians is, what about the poor? In a free market healthcare system, how do they get healthcare? Well, I grew up in the poorest city in the United States, according to the Census Bureau in the 1950s, Laredo, Texas. And I remember as a kid, and this was before Medicare and Medicaid, that you could walk into any doctor's office in Laredo and they would be filled, absolutely packed with patients, most of whom it was obvious could not pay their medical bills. And so they'd end up paying their doctors in kind, with meals or chickens or whatever. But there was never an instance, as far as I know, of anybody ever being turned away for inability to pay. The doctors just handled the patients. They'd send them the bills. But they never worried about, oh my gosh, this guy's not going to pay me. I'm not going to let him come in, or I'm going to make him pay in advance. And oh, by the way, doctors were among the wealthiest people in town. In fact, they were second only to the oil people. And that is why, the reason for that is because they were getting their money from the middle class and the wealthy, and they were subsidizing the free provision of health care for the poor. And this is what genuine charity is all about. We've talked about that as libertarians. Genuine charity doesn't have anything to do with Medicare, Medicaid, these bureaucracies and the IRS. Genuine charity is when you help out somebody through the goodness of your own heart and entirely voluntarily. And that's exactly what would happen in a free market healthcare system. And that's why we've got to restore this sense of confidence and freedom, where people believe not only in themselves, but they believe in others and they believe in the market process. We once had the finest healthcare system in the world, one where doctors love what they were doing, Sheldon, and now you got doctors just retiring early. They're disgusted with their profession and all this fraud and soaring healthcare costs. Absolute mess, but how could you have predicted otherwise with healthcare socialism and interventionism?
Well, licensing and the control of medical hospitals came in the early part of the 20th century, when there was concern that there were too many doctors and too many hospitals, and this was driving down incomes. And this is when licensing and other kind of certification comes in, and a whole bunch of medical schools were closed on the basis of a Rockefeller Foundation report saying there were too many medical schools and too many doctors. This was purely out of the self-interest of doctors. It wasn't for the sake of patients. And the schools that tended to get closed down, I think like half of them got closed down, private medical colleges, were those that were women's and African-American medical colleges. By coincidence, so those were the ones that got closed down. Another way that low-income people and middle-income people, including many immigrants, got medical care in the early part of the 20th century was through the mutual aid society system. These organizations, which were first designed around social social functions, a place to go and, with your friends and play some pool or play some cards and, have a drink. They started providing services, one of which was known as lodge practice. They would contract with a doctor on an annual basis, and they would interview doctors, and then the membership would decide which doctor they wanted to sign the contract with. And then that doctor during the year provided medical services to the members of the lodge and their families. And it was one of the benefits. It was a competitive benefit for joining one lodge rather than another lodge. It was very popular. It was quite a success, but organized medicine did not like it because it was driving down incomes, and they insulted the doctors as members of, who had to resort to lodge practice as if that was some sort of demeaning thing. And they even leaned on hospitals and said, don't give privileges to doctors who are engaged in lodge practice. So they kind of crushed the institution, even though it was a way for low-income people and middle-income people to get regular medical care. They solved the problem ages ago that Obama says, that he's trying to solve.
Yeah, well, on your first point about the medical licensure, there's a great essay, as you know, by Milton Friedman on this issue, and people can come to our website at the Future of Freedom Foundation. We have it posted there. It's called Medical Licensure. You can just Google that by Milton Friedman. And Friedman tackled the most difficult of all the issues in the area of licensure, medical licensure, and he showed why you're better off repealing the licensure requirement, despite people's fear that, quacks can end up operating on their brain or whatever, brain surgery. Friedman addresses all of these, arguments that are posed in favor of medical licensure. And it's really just a protection racket, as you indicated. It's a protection racket for people that have the licenses, and not only in medical care, but, shoe shine, lawyers, the whole kit and caboodle. And the other one's a great example of what a market process will produce, where people are getting together and mutually benefiting from, getting together in these clubs and associations and getting health care that way, and spreading the costs, spreading the risks. I thought in our remaining time, Sheldon, we want to at least mention the other shutdown debate coming up, and that's on the debt ceiling, which is something entirely different. You've got this maximum amount of debt that the government is can incur. That's, to me, an implicit acknowledgement that too much debt is a bad thing. A debt ceiling is saying you can't incur any more debt beyond this amount. And that's saying because it's a bad thing. We see what happens with Greece. We see what happens with these cities that are going bankrupt. And yet every time this ceiling, this maximum is reached, they enact legislation to raise it again, which then can add more debt on top of the existing debt. And what I find fascinating about this is that each time they do this, they don't immediately say, well, now we've got to slash spending here because we're going to be reaching a new ceiling in 2 or 3 years here now. No, they immediately go out to the bars and they toast and they celebrate and they laugh and they say, we did it again. And they just start calling for more increased spending. Why? Because they know that next time the ceiling comes around, they're going to do it again. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as this process is going on and they have no regard for the taxpayers of America, then the debt ceiling should not be lifted at all. Because you know darn well it doesn't do any good to just add more debt and continue this process. And that the Republicans are playing this game not to slash spending, but to get some perks that they want as part of this negotiating process, some benefits for their constituents that have really nothing to do with substantive slashing of government spending. And as far as I'm concerned, they ought to just let the debt ceiling stay there, live within their means, whatever taxes come in, they decide what to do with that money. If they got to lay off people, if they got to get out in Afghanistan, if they got to get rid of the drug war, so be it.
I call it the debt sky because apparently the sky's the limit. So why do we call it a limit? No, that's true. And some people don't think there should have to be a limit. I mean, it's not it's not in the Constitution that there needs to be a limit. They just think anytime they spend, if that means higher borrowing, then so be it. I mean, there is that point of view among non-libertarians, of course. What the government does, what the Congress does, and I don't even understand how in sort of conventional terms people don't see this as outrageous, but they incur expenses knowing full well that their credit card will be maxed out at the time the bills come due unless that limit is raised. But they can't say for certain it will be raised. I mean, obviously it will be, but it's not like an act of nature. They actually have to vote for it. So they're using what they know will be maxed out credit cards, counting on the fact that the limit will be raised. And of course, backing all this up is, of course, their ability to threaten violence against people if they don't cough up the resources, namely taxation. So that it all stands on that. You and I can't do that. If you and I tried that, we would pay a penalty very quickly. So it's a big swindle to begin with. But there's an even bigger swindle. I wrote about this in Friday's article, and I agree with Lysander Spooner on this. In whose name have they borrowed this money, and by what authority? I mean, I never signed any kind of papers. I don't see why I'm liable for debts that the members of Congress and the administration and members of these agencies have entered into. The Treasury, I guess, is the other party in the debt. I mean, I didn't agree to that, so I don't understand why I'm on the hook for any of that, and that goes for everybody else I know.
Yeah, but as a practical matter, you know darn well that if push comes to shove, they're going to come collecting. And it could get nasty. When this happened in, I think it was Argentina several years ago, the government simply confiscated people's retirement accounts and, gave them in exchange government bonds, more debt, but they took the money. And I wouldn't put anything past this federal government, especially in a crisis. And we saw what Roosevelt did when he nationalized everybody's gold, forced everybody to turn in their gold on pain of being a felon if they got caught owning gold. I mean, that had been the official money of the United States, and they confiscated that. So there's no telling what can happen. And the more that this government adds to this debt level, the riskier things get. They keep saying that the U.S. debt has been downgraded because of this debt ceiling debate. That's just nonsense. It's not the debate that causes the downgrade. It's that the government incurs more and more and more debt. It's like a private person. You have so much debt, and your income is only at a certain minimal level. Your credit rating is going to go down because people are going to say you can't pay back that debt with the amount of money you're bringing in. It's no different with the government. And so, what do we libertarians say? Well, in the short term, Republicans say they want to balance the budget. Here's your way to balance the budget. Don't raise the debt ceiling. Make the government live off the tax revenues that it's bringing in. There you got a perfectly balanced budget. Is that an ideal for us libertarians? Of course not, because you still got the government doing all these illegitimate things, the drug war, foreign interventionism, foreign aid, especially foreign aid to dictatorships. The welfare state, all the welfare functions, the Medicare, the Medicaid, the farm subsidies. I mean, get rid of all that stuff. But, I mean, that's obviously the solution for the long term. But in the short term, I say don't raise that debt ceiling at all.
Well, of course, the government is paying a couple $100 billion a year in interest on the debt. So they could cut $100 billion, a couple $100 billion, I don't know, maybe up to $4, it maybe down a little bit. They could cut that.
Hey, Sheldon, I lost you. I can't hear you. In any event, we're going to wrap up. I think I lost Sheldon. This is the Libertarian Angle. And I'm Jacob Hornberger, and that was